Hello, I'm Jeff Nichols. I'm the CEO of the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Thank you all for joining us. And I want to welcome Cooper Wingert here today to talk about his latest work, fighting for state citizenship in the U.S. colored troops. Cooper, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. I saw this article pop up from some of the professors you have in Georgetown sharing your work. It's been recently published in Civil War History, which is published by Kent State University Press. And it intrigued me because it's obviously talking about state citizenship, and it's principally about Pennsylvania. And so much of it has to do with Harrisburg as well. But before we dive into your piece, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're working on today?
Yeah, this piece is kind of, as you alluded to, a bit of a homecoming for me because I'm from the Harrisburg area. I kind of cut my teeth in archives, like the state archives in Harrisburg, historical societies in Cumberland and Dauphin counties, which is really where I learned to do research. And I'm now doing my PhD at Georgetown, and I've been in the National Archives for the past 2 years, doing research for my dissertation. But this was kind of an opportunity was I found some material that intrigued me and an opportunity to return to my roots and writing about history in the Harrisburg area.
That's great. And by the way, I moved to Boiling Springs when I came to Pennsylvania 2 years ago. And so your book on the Underground Railroad was very eye-opening and informative for me since it was one of the stops along the Underground Railroad, which is the area is filled with them, including Harrisburg. But so can you tell us a little bit about your latest work fighting for state citizenship in the U.S. colored troops? Why did you write it, and what's the overall theme? And then we'll dive into some of the details.
Yeah, so this article, articles take a little bit, time to write, but this one kind of had been in the works more or less, even though I didn't realize it, for over a decade. My first book was The Confederate Approach on Harrisburg, which came out in 2012, and that book was a history of the Confederate Army's advance towards Harrisburg right before the Battle of Gettysburg. And I, did a lot of research in local archives, the state archives, on the Union troops who defended Harrisburg, the Confederates who were making movements and coming within a few miles of the state capitol. And in the process of researching that, I ran across a number of oral histories in the Harrisburg area and also just a handful of references to the presence of African American troops volunteering to defend Harrisburg. And I guess I was, the typical skeptical academic historian, even though I was in high school at the time. And I was, trying to find, well, show me the sources. The best thing I could find at the time, I figured if there had been actually Black troops defending Harrisburg, it would have caused a big uproar, controversy. So there would have been plenty of evidence about it. And the best thing I could find was a throwaway one-line account in the Philadelphia Press that two Black companies had marched across the river to defend Harrisburg. But if you know anything about 19th century newspapers, they kind of were more like tabloids than the impartial journalism that we aspire to today.
Before coming here a number of years ago, I worked at the Mark Twain House in Hartford, Connecticut. Mark Twain started his career as a journalist, and he tended to tell, as he put it, stretchers. So I think I understand completely what you're talking about, but please go ahead.
No, exactly. That's a great point. And so I was skeptical. I mean, that was the only evidence I could find. I looked in all the usual places that Civil War historians look for evidence of troops that were mustered into the service. So for Pennsylvania, we have Samuel Bates has these 5 volumes called The History of Pennsylvania Volunteers, which is quite literally, it was compiled by the state government after the Civil War, a list of every regiment, every unit that was mustered into the service from Pennsylvania. There was no record of them there. I looked in the official records of the War of the Rebellion compiled by the U.S. War Department. Couldn't find any trace of them there either. So in my book, Confederate Approach on Harrisburg, I wrote that as far as we could tell, there were no African American troops who served in the Gettysburg campaign to defend Harrisburg. We know there's no African Americans who served in the Army of the Potomac, which fought at Gettysburg. So a couple years go by, and a local historian, Caleb Jackson, was doing newspaper research, and he found this account from a veteran of the companies. 1913 it was published, so 50 years after the Gettysburg campaign. And it was a long recollection from Sergeant Cassius Brown outlining his service in the companies. So clearly I realized, well, this didn't just come out of thin air. This guy isn't just fabricating his story 50 years after the battle. So I started to do some digging, and I still couldn't really find any official sources confirming the companies existed. This was during COVID, mind you, so we really didn't have much of an option to go beyond digital sources, beyond newspapers. And then in 2021, the state archives finally reopened. And I was, I think, the second person in, and we had a 3-hour time slot. So I was allowed to come in from 9 a.m. and I had to leave by noon for social distancing and everything.
Right.
And I was going through all the governor's papers, couldn't find anything. It was frustrating. And right before noon, right before I was going to be, politely asked to leave, I found in the state arsenal records the record of arms issued to these companies. So it's kind of a literal smoking gun in the arsenal records.
Issued in Harrisburg? These guns were issued when they were in Harrisburg? Yeah.
Issued from the state arsenal in Harrisburg on June 28th, the same day that Cassius Brown, in his recollection, recalled being mustered in. So it all kind of aligned up. And I realized that now I could prove my earlier assumption was wrong, that in fact there were 2 African-American companies who 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg integrated the state militia and, became the first Black soldiers to fight for the state of Pennsylvania.
Wow. So, and this is another reason why I enjoy history so much and talking to historians, because you obviously wrote something earlier in your career, and then it was corrected when more evidence was uncovered. So fact-based research is so important. And so now that you sort of set the stage of what the article is about and the story, can you talk a little bit in a little broader context about Harrisburg in June and July of 1863? What was happening? Why were these troops needed? It's all pretty obvious, but just to lay out what was happening in the immediate area.
Sure. So the Confederate Army starts moving north for Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in early June 1863. By the middle of the month, they're in Pennsylvania, and Lee splits his army up, later controversially, but about a third of the Confederate Army is making a beeline for Harrisburg. They're coming up what we would now think of as Route 11 through Chambersburg, Shippensburg, Carlisle. There are Confederate forces. By the end of June, there are about 15,000 Confederates in Carlisle. There's about 1,200 cavalry in Mechanicsburg, and on what we now think of as the West Shore area across from Harrisburg. So there's a kind of a scramble on the part of the Union authorities to defend Harrisburg. The Army of the Potomac, which is the main Union army that's combating Lee, is lagging behind. They're still in Maryland while all of this is happening. They're just getting across the border. So the War Department, in the meantime, had organized the Department of the Susquehanna. This was a military department headquartered in Harrisburg that was to defend the state capital. And they appoint Major General Darius Couch, a former Army of the Potomac Corps commander, to head this department from Harrisburg. And Couch works with the Pennsylvania governor, Andrew Curtin, and really they aren't given any troops. They kind of just have to assemble things in a hodgepodge fashion. Curtin is calling for militia. Initially, the response from Pennsylvania isn't that prompt. So the New York National Guard come down to the state capitol. Finally, Pennsylvania militiamen start to volunteer, but really they have a few thousand men by the time late June rolls around, but it's not an impressive force. And Harrisburg is clearly in danger because you have experienced Confederate, veteran soldiers marching through the state capitol, which is defended by these poorly trained, hastily organized militia.
And when you say poorly trained and hastily organized militia, of course, they were white militia, principally. And your research has uncovered, amongst other research done by earlier historians, and a lot of them locally, so like Caleb, who we know here quite well, is a wonderful guy, but that there were African Americans who were volunteering to join militia or to form militia units. But the state wasn't, and even the city itself wasn't always open to that. Can you talk about that relationship and how it came to be finally that these 2 units of African American militia were mustered into service?
Absolutely. So one of the final version of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln edited it up until January 1st, 1863. When he releases it, it includes authorizing the enlistment of African American soldiers. But Lincoln leaves it up to states themselves to decide whether they want to do so. So we often hear the 54th Massachusetts, the movie Glory. Massachusetts is kind of leading the way in terms of enlisting African Americans. But most northern states don't. Kansas also does, but Kansas is kind of like the Wild West in the 1860s. Everything's happening there. But Pennsylvania, for instance, Governor Curtin is a Republican. He is an ally of Lincoln, but he's up for re-election in 1863, and he doesn't believe that he fears that if he supports Black enlistment and opens up Black enlistment, that's going to hurt his chances for re-election. So African Americans in Harrisburg, in particular, had been trying to enlist ever since the Emancipation Proclamation. Some of the figures we talk about, like T. Morris Chester, who is a Harrisburg native. He had actually gone to Liberia and become a colonizationist before the war, but he returns to Harrisburg during the Civil War. And Chester is trying to organize companies and trying to pressure Curtin to accept Black troops in Pennsylvania. Chester eventually kind of gives up on Curtin, and he ends up becoming a recruiter for the 54th Massachusetts. But the point, and a lot of Black men, I should say, from Harrisburg, from South Central PA, leave to go to Massachusetts. But the point I want to make is that they would have preferred, most of them, to have enlisted in Pennsylvania, because they had been trying for decades to claim membership as Pennsylvania, as citizens of Pennsylvania. We often think of citizenship as now we're U.S. citizens. In the 19th century, before the Civil War, people thought of citizenship primarily in terms of states. So for people like Chester, for African Americans in Harrisburg, the idea of going to Massachusetts might help them get citizenship on the national level, but it really wouldn't help them get citizenship in Pennsylvania. They wanted to serve in a Pennsylvania unit. That was the key for them. So many do go, somewhat reluctantly, to Massachusetts to enlist. So come, June 1863, Curtin still, the official policy is no Black troops in Pennsylvania. When he issues a proclamation on June 15th, 1863, calling for Pennsylvania militia, as I alluded to earlier, the response from white Pennsylvanians is kind of lackluster. But he gets telegraphs later the same day from all over the Commonwealth, from Williamsport, from Philadelphia, from African Americans offering their services to serve as Pennsylvania militia. And one company of Black troops from Philadelphia, commanded by Octavius Catto, actually get on board a train and go to Harrisburg and physically present themselves, offering themselves for service, and they're turned away. Governor Curtin and General Couch both, I think General Couch for sure was more conservative politically. He had been a Democrat before the war. Curtin, I think, feared, the official excuse was they feared that accepting Black troops would discourage white volunteers from enlisting. Mm-hmm. But I think certainly for Couch, it had to do with deeper political convictions as well. That he was a Democrat and not he was not one of the anti-slavery political generals for sure. So that brings us to mid-June. 10 days later, on June 25th, the Confederates are inching closer and closer, and still the capital is poorly defended. And T. Morris Chester and another African-American leader from Harrisburg, Henry Bradley, have an idea that there's a lot of enslaved and free people running up the Cumberland Valley to Harrisburg in the path of Lee's army. Lee's army was known for its bad treatment of African Americans it encountered, oftentimes re-enslaving people, whether they were free or runaways. It really didn't matter. So there's a lot of Black refugees streaming into Harrisburg. And for the most part, the Union Army had been impressing them to work on the fortifications across the river from Harrisburg. But Bradley and Chester have an idea that perhaps they could form these men into companies and parade them in front of the Capitol, and basically say to Governor Curtin, you are begging for volunteers. Curtin's issuing proclamation after proclamation. Here are 2 companies of volunteers ready to defend Harrisburg today. And ultimately, that is what moves the needle. I think it's the date I'm pretty sure the decision is made is June 27th. So this is literally, Confederates are in Carlisle. They're, 15, 20 miles away at this point. Mm-hmm. And Curtin accepts those 2 companies, though he doesn't make this a broader change in policy. He just accepts their services, but he doesn't telegraph the other Black companies who had offered their services throughout the state and say, now I'm accepting you. I think for Curtin, it was a one-off. The Confederates are closing in. It's better to have 2 companies of people, 2 more companies of people than two less per
And
se.
the troops that came from Pennsylvania, the African Americans came from Pennsylvania, they were turned away earlier.
So that there were,
I mean, from Philadelphia. Excuse me, from Philadelphia.
oh yeah. That was on June 17th. Was Octavius Catto's company came in,
so 10 days.
And Couch and Curtin turned them away, send them back.
Okay.
And they do not return. Again, I'm not sure. I think for Curtin it was a local exception because these people were in Harrisburg and because the Confederate Army had come so close. I do want to just make it clear that the leadership of the companies were Black Harrisburgers, like Henry Bradley, T. Morris Chester. They were the leaders of the two companies. The majority that we actually don't know the composition because we don't have a muster roll surviving from these companies. We don't know what percentage of them were from Harrisburg, which percentage of them were from Maryland or Virginia even, or Southern Pennsylvania. But it seems like a good bit of the rank and file men of these companies were people who had recently arrived in Harrisburg fleeing the path of Lee's army.
So it's obvious that the Lee's troops never made it this far, but to Harrisburg. But what role did the two regiments, militia regiments, play in the days leading up to the battle after they were mustered in?
Sure. So there's a big ceremony on June 28th. This is Sunday, June 28th. The Confederates are in Mechanicsburg by this point, so they're only 5 miles away. There's ceremony on the Capitol grounds. The Adjutant General of the state, which I think is ironic, he says that he musters them in and says, "Your names will go down in undying fame," which turned out not to be the case.
That's right.
Exactly. They march across what was then the Camelback Bridge, we now know as the Market Street Bridge, across the Susquehanna River. They go actually onto picket duty at Oysters Point, which was the center of the skirmishing on June 28th and June 29th. It's essentially modern day Camp Hill. And they are under Confederate artillery fire for quite a bit. Then they're removed to the forts, and they remain in Fort Washington, the defenses of Harrisburg, for several days. And then their services were no longer needed. And that becomes a whole other story where Harrisburg City Council, Harrisburg had a Democratic mayor who was very conservative, very anti-emancipation, and he complained bitterly that the two companies had ever been allowed to enlist in the first place. And he makes it known that he doesn't want them lingering about the city, especially being armed. So there's pressure from Harrisburg, and as best as I can tell, the companies essentially dissolve after by the first week of July 1863, after the emergency is passed and their services are no longer needed.
So part of what you mentioned earlier in the conversation, and I think that it's kind of a bit counterintuitive today because of the Civil War amendments, but the African American soldiers, as well as the residents of Harrisburg, look to the state to really provide them with their basic civil rights or defend their basic civil rights, whether it was the right to vote or other things eventually. Can you talk a little bit about that perspective? And of course, it all changes with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. But that was another intriguing piece of this story for me, to hear that a majority of African Americans really did look to the individual states for their rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of it is, so, we tend to read back in history that we know the 14th Amendment passes that guarantees birthright citizenship. We know the 15th Amendment guaranteeing black male suffrage. And those 1868, 1870, and that makes it a federal government issue. But before the Civil War, voting rights and other rights we think of as civil rights were largely determined at the state level, which is why, for instance, the Black Harrisburgers that I talk about in this article were so insistent on enlisting at the state level. The other reason, too, is once the federal government finally formalizes their system of black recruitment, which they're doing during the summer of 1863, it's kind of unclear what's happening during this whole Gettysburg campaign. But the result is what they call the Bureau of Colored Troops. And this means that any African-American men, regardless of where they enlist, whatever state they enlist directly into the federal service. And the way it has some benefits from the standpoint of federal policymakers. One is that you no longer have to wait on governors like Curtin to authorize enlistment. It also kind of relieves them of having to make an unpopular decision. The other kind of thing the War Department does to sweeten this, normally we don't think of governors welcoming centralization by the federal government, is they say that any Black troops who enlist in your state will count towards your state's quota. And that was intended really to kind of get the white Northern public on board with Black enlistment. In a very selfish way, that if there are Black men enlisting, that means fewer white men have to enlist. The draft doesn't have quite as big of a reach. But what I found in studying Black Harrisburgers and other Black Northern veterans is the quota meant a lot to them because it allowed them to make a claim on their state government. If you just go run a search through any Black newspaper in the Civil War with quota and USCT, you'll find so much talk about the quota. And this is really meaningful for Black Northerners. Even if their state governors wouldn't authorize them to enlist, they could go to a federal recruiter and enlist and count towards their state's quota. So what ends up happening for a lot of the men in these two companies that are raised around Harrisburg is they end up going to Camp William Penn near Philadelphia and enlisting in USCT regiments. So they're entering directly into the federal service, but when they return home, there's a kind of a USCT grand review in Harrisburg in November 1865. And in the speeches there, they're talking about, we helped fill up Pennsylvania's quota. So the quota was a big deal for Black veterans. And what I think it reminds us of is, in 1865, 1866, as far as African Americans were concerned, they had a longer history negotiating with Northern state governments than they did with the federal government. Up until 1860, the federal government had been pretty much firmly in the hands of slaveholders who had denied Black citizenship. We know of the Dred Scott ruling. But African Americans had, if not necessarily a great relationship, they had relationships with their Northern state. They had rights like personal liberty laws that protected them from kidnapping. In some states, especially in New England, African Americans had the right to vote, even in 1860. So from the standpoint of African Americans, it might have seemed a far more likely proposition to get citizenship from the state governments rather than the federal government. We have the hindsight of history to know that, in fact, it's the Reconstruction leads to this sweeping 14th and 15th Amendments that make citizenship a national thing, but they didn't know that during the Civil War.
No, you can't predict the future, and that's for sure. And the other piece of it being birthright citizenship, which came about through the 14th Amendment, which of course is still with us to this very day. Discussions about that with immigrants and various other things. So these issues that sometimes seem to be put to bed in our country tend to come back and end this cycle. So these two units were only mustered in for a week or 2 weeks, something like that in total. But there's some interesting side stories that go along with that. And one you had already mentioned was T. Morris Chester, who was a very interesting person and from Harrisburg. Can you tell us a little bit about him and what he went on to do after his captaincy in the militia here in Harrisburg?
Yeah, so T. Morris Chester is born in Harrisburg. He's kind of born into one of the Underground Railroad families. Both his parents are Underground Railroad activists. And this is a big debate among the Black community in Harrisburg, but Black communities everywhere in the North. Before the Civil War in the 1850s, Chester becomes very disillusioned with the United States. He simply doesn't believe that there's a future for African Americans in the United States. And he becomes a colonizationist. Most time we think of colonizationists as whites who are trying to remove African Americans from the country. Chester was a colonizationist because he simply believed that there was no future for African Americans in the United States. When the Civil War breaks out, he's in Liberia. He returns. The Emancipation Proclamation completely flips his view. He thinks that there's a chance that African Americans could be full citizens, and that's where he returns to Harrisburg. He's in Harrisburg during the spring of 1863, trying to either persuade Governor Curtin or to lead men up to Massachusetts to enlist. And then he's on hand in Harrisburg in June 1863 to captain one of those two companies. So after this, the part of the story I forgot to mention is that the two companies were offered by Lorenzo Thomas, who is the Adjutant General of the U.S. Army, a chance to enlist directly in the USCT on July 5th or 6th. And they refused because Thomas would not allow them to retain their Black officers, Chester and Bradley. So Chester is one of actually the very first, not federally recognized, but in the state unit, Black officers during the Civil War. Chester, after this, goes on to be a very well-known war correspondent, reporting from the front lines. And then after that, he ends up going to Louisiana and Reconstruction, and being involved with efforts to establish a biracial democracy in the South. So Chester has a very long career. There's a great biography and edited works by Richard Blackett of Chester. So a really intriguing local figure.
He truly is. And this is a very intriguing story. Any other takeaways you would want people to have from this story about this legacy?
I think there's definitely the lesson about citizenship. I'd also say on a more of a kind of a they were there. No, we often talk about the Gettysburg campaign, and we've kind of say that there are no African American troops involved in the Gettysburg campaign, and there were no African Americans fighting for the Union Army at Gettysburg, but there were African Americans who were involved in the Gettysburg campaign who were under Confederate artillery fire. And I think we should notice that they were there. And like I said, some local historians have noticed they were there, but I think a combination of the recollection and then finding the evidence in the state archives helps us really confirm their presence, but also a little bit about why they were insistent on fighting for Pennsylvania. And what they were hoping to get out of that, and the opportunity that kind of the chaos of an invasion opens for people trying to press for change.
This was a fascinating read for me. I really enjoyed it, and I filled in some blanks for me as well. Yeah, another reason why the National Civil War Museum is located here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. But Cooper, what's next? What else are you working? Where do you go from here?
Well, I'm working on my dissertation right now. So the questions of federalism and wartime emancipation are really what interests me. And this was a kind of the other side of the story, in that federalism and how that affected Black Northerners' response to the Emancipation Proclamation. What I'm working on now is how wartime emancipation played out in the South, and particularly with the Union Army's military police, who are known as provost marshals. So a story that takes me a little bit away from Harrisburg, but as this article proves, I tend to find my way back to Harrisburg in my projects one way or the other.